On the morning of August 10th, 2000, a young Russian woman named Olga Kolesnikova stood on a wooden dock at Vidyayevo on the Kola Peninsula and waved at her husband. He was 27 years old. His name was Dmitri. He was a lieutenant captain of the Russian Navy. He was about to board the submarine K-141 Kursk for what should have been a 4-day exercise. He waved back at her from the open hatch. He smiled. He shouted that he would be home for her birthday on August 14th. Then he disappeared down into the steel hull. That was the last time anyone in the world who loved Dmitri Kolesnikov saw him alive. 118 souls boarded the K-141 Kursk that morning. Not one of them would step ashore again. Within 4 days, every single one of them would be dead at the bottom of the Barents Sea. And 23 of them, 23 men in the rear compartments of that submarine, would die slowly enough to write letters home in the dark, in the cold, knowing exactly what was happening to them, and knowing exactly who was choosing not to come for them. Tonight, we're going to walk through every hour of those 4 days. The exercise, the 2 explosions, the knocking on the hull, the 5 Norwegian divers who could have reached them in 12 hours, but were not allowed in for 5 full days. The letter Dmitri Kolesnikov wrote in the dark with frozen fingers, addressed to a wife he would never see again. The decision a new Russian president made on a beach in Sochi, while 23 of his men breathed the last oxygen in a submerged steel coffin 108 meters below the surface, and the 4 seconds of recorded sound that the Russian government still refuses to release. This is the story of the K-141 Kursk. The Kola Peninsula sits at the very northwest edge of Russia, above the Arctic Circle, sticking out into the Barents Sea like a clenched fist. In August, the sun never fully sets there. The water is dark green and unbearably cold even in summer. 4 degrees Celsius at the surface, 2 degrees 30 meters down, freezing close to the seabed. The wind comes off the Arctic in long, flat sheets that smell of salt and diesel and old fish. The town of Vidyayevo, where the Kursk was based, was built in the 1960s as a closed military settlement. Civilians could not enter without permission. Most of the buildings were Soviet-era concrete. The streets were paved badly. The summer was 3 weeks long. The winter was 8 months. The 5,000 people who lived there were almost all submariners, their wives and their children. Everything in Vidyayevo orbited the sea and the boats that went into it. The K-141 Kursk was the pride of the Northern Fleet. She was an Oscar II-class submarine, 154 meters long, 18 meters wide, 23,000 tons submerged. She had a double hull, an inner pressure hull made of high-strength steel, and an outer hull around it for hydrodynamics, separated by 2.5 meters of free space. She had 2 nuclear reactors. She carried 24 Granite cruise missiles, designed to sink an American aircraft carrier from 600 kilometers away. She was, on the morning of August 10th, 2000, the largest attack submarine in the world that was not a missile boat. The Kursk was 8 years old. She had completed a deployment to the Mediterranean in 1999, the first Russian naval deployment to that sea since the Soviet collapse. She came home decorated. Her commander, Captain First Rank Gennady Lyakhin, was 45 years old, a veteran officer respected by his crew, married with 2 children. He had specifically requested the Mediterranean assignment. He believed in the new Russia. He believed the Northern Fleet could come back. The exercise that began on August 10th, 2000, was supposed to prove that belief. It was the largest Russian naval exercise since 1991. 30 surface ships, several submarines, land-based aviation, anti-submarine helicopters, the full Northern Fleet gathered in the Barents Sea, simulating combat against a hypothetical NATO carrier group. Putin, who had been Russian president for 6 months, had personally signed off on the exercise budget. He wanted the world, and his own country, to see that the Russian Navy still existed. The Kursk was assigned to fire 2 torpedoes at the surface fleet. One was a standard practice torpedo. The other was a Type 65-76. The Type 65-76 was a problem. Submariners knew this. Submarine engineers knew this. The Soviet Navy had known it since 1986. Western intelligence agencies had known it for years. It was a 65-centimeter wake-homing torpedo designed to take out aircraft carriers and large surface combatants. It was 11 meters long. It weighed 4,750 kilograms. It was the largest torpedo in the world. The crews who had to load it called it Tolstushka, fat girl. The reason the Type 65-76 was a problem was its propellant. It used high-test peroxide, HTP, as fuel. HTP is hydrogen peroxide, concentrated to about 85%. The British Royal Navy stopped using HTP in torpedoes in 1955 after a torpedo with the same chemistry exploded on a submarine called HMS Sidon and killed 13 men in Portland Harbor. The US Navy never used HTP at all. The Soviet Navy had continued to use it because it was cheap, fast, and provided excellent range. But HTP has one fatal property. If it leaks, if it touches catalytic surfaces, copper alloys, certain steels, organic materials, it decomposes violently. It can detonate without an ignition source. The Soviet Navy knew this. They had recorded HTP-related incidents in 1986, 1990, 1991, and 1996. The Northern Fleet had requested replacement torpedoes for years. They had not received them. The Type 65-76 that was loaded into tube number 4 of the K-141 Kursk on the morning of August 12, 2000, was 12 years old. It had spent the previous winter in unheated storage. The seals around its fuel reservoir had been inspected, but not replaced. At 7:30 M Moscow time on August 12th, the Kursk was running on the surface in the Barents Sea, approximately 107 kilometers off the coast. The morning was clear. The sea was moderate. Captain Lyachin had been awake since 5 o'clock. He drank tea in the central post, the command compartment in the middle of the submarine. His executive officer, Captain Second Rank Sergei Dudko, briefed the day's exercises. They would dive at 8 a.m. They would conduct a torpedo attack on the flagship Pyotr Veliky at approximately 11:30 a.m. They would surface at 4 p.m. They would return to base on August 14th. The crew that morning numbered 118, 24 officers, 49 warrant officers, and 45 enlisted men. The youngest was 18. The oldest was 47. 2 were on their first deployment. 5 had served on the Kursk for the entire 8 years of her life. Lieutenant Captain Dmitri Kolesnikov was assigned to Compartment 7. the turbine compartment. His station was at the rear of the submarine, just forward of the propulsion shaft. At 8:51 a.m., the Kursk submerged. She descended to a depth of 50 meters and proceeded toward her firing position. The water around her was dark green at the surface, deepening to almost black as she went down. Outside the hull, the temperature was 4 degrees Celsius. Inside the hull, the temperature was a steady 19 degrees, kept warm by the heat from the 2 nuclear reactors and the body heat of 118 men. The lights in the corridors were dim red, the standard underway condition. Conversations were quiet. Footsteps echoed on metal grating. The submarine smelled of diesel oil, recycled air, and the faint chemical sweetness of sodium hydroxide from the carbon dioxide scrubbers. It was a normal morning. At 11:28 a.m. Moscow time, on August 12, 2000, in the Norwegian seismic monitoring station at Arkes on the island of Sakhalin, an automated sensor recorded a small underwater pressure event in the Barents Sea. The signal was weak. The seismologists who reviewed it later that day initially classified it as an unidentified, non-natural source. It was equivalent to about 100 kilograms of TNT. 2 minutes and 15 seconds later, at 11:42 a.m., the same sensor recorded a second event. This one was not weak. This one registered at 4.2 on the Richter scale. It was equivalent to between 2 and 3 tons of TNT. It was so large that it was picked up by seismic monitoring stations as far away as Alaska. Inside the Kursk, the first explosion happened in the torpedo room at the bow of the submarine, tube number 4, the type 65 to 76, the Fat Girl. HTP fuel had been leaking from the torpedo's fuel reservoir for an unknown period of time, possibly hours, possibly days. It had pooled in the bottom of the tube, where it contacted a copper alloy fitting and a small amount of organic material, possibly a hydraulic seal. The decomposition began. The temperature in tube 4 rose rapidly. At 11:28, the HTP detonated. The first explosion did not kill the submarine. It killed the 7 men who were in the torpedo compartment at that moment, and it ruptured the inner hull at compartment 1. Water began to flood the bow. The submarine began to take an upward angle as the stern compressed and the bow filled. In the central post, 3 compartments back, Captain Lyakin felt the ship lurch. He picked up the intercom. He called for damage reports. The XO confirmed an explosion forward. Lyakin ordered all stop and emergency surface. He had 135 seconds. He did not have 135 seconds. At 11:30 and 42 seconds, the heat from the first explosion reached the warheads of the other Type 65 to 76 torpedoes still loaded in the forward tubes. 6 of them. They detonated together. The combined warhead yield plus residual HTP fuel from all 6 produced an explosion equivalent to between 2 and 3 tons of TNT inside the pressure hull at the bow of the submarine. The forward 18 meters of the Kursk simply ceased to exist. The bow disintegrated. The blast traveled aft through the hull at the speed of the steel itself. It killed everyone in compartments 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 instantly, including the entire control room, including Captain Lyakin, including the XO, including the navigation officers, including the helmsman, who was at that moment trying to bring the bow up to surface. 95 of the 118 men aboard the K-141 Kursk died in less than 2 seconds. The submarine, now without command, without forward compartments, without buoyancy control, fell. She drove forward and downward at an angle. She hit the seabed at approximately 11:31 a.m. The seabed in that location was soft mud over hard rock at a depth of 108 meters. She came to rest on her keel, mostly upright, with the destroyed bow buried in the mud. The 2 reactors automatically scrammed, meaning the control rods inserted, shutting down the fission reaction. The Russian Navy, 2 hours later, would confirm via radiation sensors aboard surface ships that no nuclear release had occurred. The reactors in this one Mercy had behaved as designed. But there were still 23 men alive on the K-141 Kursk. They were in compartments 6, 7, 8, and 9, the rear of the submarine, behind the turbine room, behind the propulsion shafts. The blast had not reached them. The pressure hull aft of compartment 5 had held. They could feel the submarine on the seabed. They could hear the silence where the reactors had been. They could hear, in the distance through the steel, the moaning of metal under stress as the ship settled. In compartment 7, Lieutenant Captain Dmitri Kolesnikov stood up from where the second explosion had thrown him against a bulkhead. His ear was bleeding, his leg was bruised, the lights had failed and then come back on emergency battery. The ventilation had stopped. He counted the men around him, 8, including himself. He moved aft through the bulkhead door into compartment 8, 3 more there, then into compartment 9, the propulsion shaft compartment, the very rear of the submarine, the largest available volume of safe air, 12 more, including the senior surviving officer aboard the wreck, a captain 3rd rank named Boyarkin. 23 men, 1 compartment, approximately 1,400 cubic meters of breathable air, falling temperature, no power for the air regeneration system, no way to cool the surface. The radio antenna had been destroyed in the second blast. But there was a hatch. Compartment 9 had an emergency escape trunk built into its overhead, a vertical steel cylinder running up through the outer hull, sealed with a circular hatch on top. In normal use, the men would don escape suits, flood the trunk to equalize pressure, open the upper hatch, and float to the surface one at a time. But the surface was 108 meters away. Free ascent from that depth in 4-degree water without proper equipment was suicide. The escape trunk was meant for shallower water. The 23 men knew this. They also knew the alternative. The alternative was to wait. To wait for someone to come and find them. To wait for someone, anyone, Russian, Norwegian, British, anyone, to bring a rescue submersible down to that hatch and lock onto it from outside, equalize the pressure, and open the trunk together. There were such submersibles in the world. The Russian Northern Fleet had 2 of them. Britain had one called the LR-5. Norway had one called the Norsok. Any of them could reach the Kursk and dock with the escape trunk. The question was not whether rescue was possible. The question was how fast someone would come. The 23 men in compartment 9 did not know what was happening on the surface. They could not know that the Pyotr Veliki, the Russian flagship, was at that moment confirming via sonar that the Kursk was no longer responding. They could not know that the Northern Fleet Command was at that moment failing to inform Moscow. They could not know that Putin was at that moment in Sochi on vacation. They could not know that the British and Norwegian governments would, within hours, offer their rescue submersibles to Russia, and that those offers would be refused. They did not know that they had 4 days. They did not know they had less than 4 days. They did not know their oxygen would not last that long. What they did know was that they were alive, that the hatch was above them, that someone, somewhere, must by now be aware that the Kursk had not surfaced as scheduled, that help would come. In compartment 9 on the seabed, in 4-degree air that was already beginning to thicken with carbon dioxide, Dmitri Kolesnikov took out a small notebook and a pen. He looked at his watch. It was 11:42 a.m. Moscow time. He began to write. At 11:33 a.m. Moscow time, 3 minutes after the second explosion, the Russian flagship Pyotr Veliky detected the seismic shock through its hull-mounted sonar. The signal was strong, close, and clearly underwater. The bridge officer on the Pyotr Veliky radioed the Northern Fleet Command at Severomorsk and reported a possible underwater explosion in the exercise area. He did not yet know which submarine was missing. He requested confirmation from the Kursk. The Kursk did not respond. He requested again. He requested a third time. Nothing came back. The standard procedure when a Russian submarine fails to respond during an exercise is to wait, then call again, then alert command. The Pyotr Veliky waited. They called. They alerted command. By 12:30 p.m., an hour after the explosion, the Russian Northern Fleet headquarters at Severomorsk officially noted that the K-141 Kursk had failed to make her scheduled communication check. By 2:30 p.m., 3 hours after the explosion, the Fleet Command formally upgraded the situation to a possible vessel distress event. By 4:30 p.m., 5 hours after the explosion, the Fleet Command for the first time told the Russian Defense Ministry that a submarine might be down. The Defense Ministry did not tell President Putin until the following day. President Putin, at the time of the Kursk's destruction, was 2,400 kilometers away in Sochi, on the Black Sea, on vacation. He would remain on vacation for 4 more days. Inside compartment 9, the 23 men who were still alive could not have known any of this. They could only know what they could feel. The submarine was on the seabed. The lights were dim. The air was getting colder. They could hear through the steel of the hull the sound of distant ship propellers. The Russian surface fleet was still nearby, still searching. They tapped on the hull with hammers and wrenches in a rhythmic pattern that any submariner would recognize. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, the Morse code for SOS. They tapped for an hour, then they rested, then they tapped again. A Russian sonar officer aboard one of the surface ships, working a routine acoustic watch, picked up the rhythmic tapping at approximately 4:30 p.m. that afternoon. He logged it. He reported it to his superior. The report was recorded. The Russian Navy, that night, did not release the recording to anyone. They did not announce that they had detected survivors. They did not contact the families. The Northern Fleet Command spent the night attempting to determine whether the Kursk was, in fact, the source of the tapping. By the morning of August 13th, 21 hours after the explosion, the Russian Navy had positively confirmed that the K-141 Kursk was on the seabed at coordinates 69 degrees 40 minutes north, 37 degrees 35 minutes east, at a depth of 108 meters. They had also confirmed that survivors were tapping on the hull. The Russian Navy then announced to the press that there had been a minor incident during the exercise. They did not mention an explosion. They did not mention a submarine on the seabed. They did not mention survivors. They said that contact had been temporarily lost. They said the Kursk was undergoing scheduled emergency drills on the bottom of the sea. They did not say the words rescue operation until late on the evening of August 14th. In Vidyayevo, the home base, the wives of the 118 men began to gather at the dock. By the morning of August 13th, they were there in numbers. By the afternoon of August 13th, there were 200 of them. They did not know what had happened. They knew only that the boat had not come back when it was supposed to come back. The Russian Navy did not speak to them. Officers walked past them without making eye contact. A young woman named Olga Kolesnikova, Dmitri Kolesnikov's wife, stood on that dock for 16 hours that day. Her husband had told her he would be home for her birthday on August 14th. He did not come home. The Russian rescue effort, as it actually existed in August 2000, was deeply broken. The Northern Fleet had 2 rescue submersibles assigned to it, the AS-15 and the AS-34. The AS-15 had been undergoing maintenance in 1998 and had not been certified operational since. The AS-34 was operational, but its mothership, the rescue vessel Mikhail Rudnitsky, was not at sea on August 12th. It had to be resupplied, fueled, manned, and sailed from harbor before any rescue attempt could begin. The Rudnitsky did not arrive over the Kursk until the morning of August 14th, 48 hours after the explosion. The AS-34 attempted its first descent to the Kursk's escape hatch at approximately 6 p.m. on August 14th. The submersible was 30 years old. Its battery was at 65% of design capacity. Its docking system depended on a precise mechanical mate with the upper escape trunk hatch on the seabed. The seas above were running at 3 to 4 meters. The AS-34 reached the Kursk on its first attempt. It attempted to dock. The docking ring failed to seal. The submersible came back up. They tried again 2 hours later. The seal failed again. They tried a third time at midnight. The seal failed a third time. By the morning of August 15th, the AS-34 had attempted 6 dockings. None had succeeded. The submersible's battery was depleted. It had to be returned to the Rudnitsky for an 8-hour recharge. During that 8 hours, no rescue activity was happening at the wreck. It was at this moment, during that 8-hour gap, that the question becomes the question that has never been answered. The British government had, on August 13th, formally offered the use of the LR-5 rescue submersible. The LR-5 was newer, more reliable, and had a docking system that did not require precise alignment. It could mate with damaged hatches. It carried 12 survivors per trip. The Norwegian government had, on August 14th, formally offered the use of Norsok divers, a team of professional saturation divers who specialized in deep water rescue and underwater hull cutting. The Norwegians could be on site within 12 hours from Bergen. The British team could be on site within 24 hours from Glasgow. The Russian government refused both offers. The official reason given was security. The Kursk carried classified equipment. The Granite cruise missile guidance system, the sonar suite, the reactor controls. The Russians did not want NATO divers and engineers inside their submarine. The unofficial reason given by some Russian officials in interviews years later was pride. The Russian Navy had not yet admitted, even internally, that they could not save their own men. To accept Western help would be to admit defeat. President Putin, still in Sochi, was reportedly briefed on the British and Norwegian offers on August 14th. He reportedly told his defense minister, Igor Sergeyev, to handle it. He did not return from vacation. He did not call for international assistance. He did not, at any point during the first 3 days, speak publicly about the Kursk. Inside compartment 9, at the rear of the submarine, the 23 men were now in their second full day of survival. The temperature had dropped to single digits. The Barents Sea was cooling the steel hull from outside, and there was no internal heating. The air was deteriorating. Carbon dioxide was building up. The chemical oxygen regeneration cassettes, the standard Russian Navy emergency air system called RDU-25, were the only thing keeping them breathing. Each cassette produced oxygen and absorbed carbon dioxide for approximately 1 hour. There were enough cassettes in compartment 9 to last 23 men approximately 5 days. 5 days at the absolute outside. The cassettes, however, had a problem. The RDU, 25 cassettes, generated oxygen by chemical reaction with seawater. They had to be activated by immersion. If a cassette was dropped into water that had any organic contamination, fuel oil, hydraulic fluid, sewage, the chemical reaction could go violent. The cassette could ignite. The cassette could explode. There had been cases. The training manual for compartment 9 was specific. Insert cassettes only into clean seawater with no oil contamination. Inspect each cassette before activation. The Kursk's compartment 9, by the second day, was no longer dry. Seawater had begun to seep through the bulkhead seals from the destroyed compartments forward. The water on the floor of compartment 9 was contaminated with oil and hydraulic fluid from the broken systems. The men knew this. They had no choice. They had to use the cassettes anyway. At some point on August 14th, the timestamp is not definitively known, one of the men in compartment 9 dropped a cassette into the contaminated water on the floor. The cassette ignited. The fire was small but immediate. It consumed all available oxygen in a fraction of a second. The 23 men, in the moment of the flash, breathed in a cloud of superheated gas that scorched their lungs. The fire then went out because there was no more oxygen to feed it, and because the cassette was now submerged. But the air in compartment 9 had been changed. It was no longer breathable. The men who had survived the fire, and the autopsies would later show that not all of them did, now had perhaps minutes, perhaps tens of minutes, of consciousness left. Dmitri Kolesnikov, in those minutes, finished his letter. The letter was found 2 months later, when his body was recovered. It was on his chest, folded in a sealed plastic bag he had taken from the submarine's medical kit. The Russian Navy initially classified it. They did not release it to his family. The letter was leaked to a Russian newspaper in October 2000. It read in part, "It is dark to write here, but I will try to do it blindly. It seems we have no chances, 10 to 20%. Let us hope that someone will read this. there is the list of the personnel from the other compartments who are now in the 9th and will attempt to escape. Greetings to everyone. Do not despair. Olga, I love you. Do not suffer too much. Greetings to GV. Greetings to all my family. Mitya. Mitya was Dmitri's nickname. Olga was Olga, his wife. The letter was dated August 12, 2000, the same day as the explosion. Kolesnikov had written it within hours of the disaster, while there was still hope. The Russian Navy, by the time the letter was leaked, had already announced that the men in compartment 9 had died instantly in the second explosion. The letter proved this was a lie. Kolesnikov had been alive long enough to write a careful, organized note, list the survivors by name, and address it to specific people. He had been alive long enough to know he would not survive. The Russian government, when confronted with the letter, said that Kolesnikov must have written it within minutes of his death. They said the men in compartment 9 had survived a few hours, not days. They said all rescue had been impossible from the moment of the explosion. They said this in spite of the tapping signals their own sonar operators had recorded for the first 14 to 18 hours after the explosion. By the morning of August 16th, 4 days after the disaster, Putin had finally returned to Moscow. He had not yet visited Vidyayevo. He had not yet spoken to the families. He went on Russian state television and gave one interview. The interviewer asked him what had happened to the Kursk. Putin gave one of the most infamous answers in a Russian political history. He looked at the camera. He paused. He said in a flat voice, "Ona utonula." It sank. 2 words. That was the official answer. That was the answer the families heard. That was the answer the world heard. By the time he gave it, the Russian government had finally, after 4 days of refusing, accepted the Norwegian offer of assistance. The Norwegian dive ship Seaway Eagle arrived over the Kursk at 7 a.m. on August 17th, 2000. 5 days, 19 hours, and 32 minutes after the explosion. The Norwegian saturation divers descended in their diving bell to a depth of 100 meters and approached the Kursk's escape hatch on the upper hull of compartment 9. They photographed the hatch. They documented the condition. They listened with hydrophones for any signs of life. There were none. There had not been signs of life from the Kursk for at least 72 hours by then. The divers cut into the outer hull. They equalized pressure. They opened the upper escape trunk. They were able to do all of this in less than 12 hours. The interior of compartment 9 was completely flooded. The water had come in slowly, through the same bulkhead seals that had failed during the second day. The 23 men inside, by the time the Norwegians opened the hatch, had been dead for at least 3 days. Some had drowned. Some had asphyxiated when the cassette caught fire. Some had simply hypothermic shocked. The bodies were carried up one at a time over the next several days by the Norwegian divers. The Russian families were told, finally, definitively, that there were no survivors. The total time elapsed from the second explosion to the opening of the escape hatch by the Norwegians was 139 hours. The Norwegians, once permitted to work, completed the operation in less than 12 hours. The British LR-5 submersible, which had been refused entry, sat unused on a dock in Glasgow for the entire week. Its crew watched the news from Scotland. The British government released a statement saying their team had been ready to depart with 12 hours' notice from August 13th onward. 12 hours from August 13th would have placed the LR-5 at the Kursk's hatch on the morning of August 14th. There were 23 men still alive in compartment 9 on the morning of August 14th. Some of them were still alive on the morning of August 15th. This is not opinion. This is established fact, as documented in the Russian government's own subsequent investigation, the Klebanov Commission, which reported in 2002. The Klebanov Commission found that survivors had likely been alive for between 6 and 72 hours after the second explosion. The exact length of survival could not be determined for individuals because of the chemical fire and the subsequent flooding. But for the question that mattered, could the survivors have been rescued if international help had been accepted on the day of the explosion? The Commission gave no clear answer. It is the question Olga Kolesnikova has spent the rest of her life asking. It is the question every family member of the 118 men has spent the rest of their lives asking. It is the question the Russian government has spent the last 26 years not answering. Tonight, in the third part of this story, we are going to look at what happened after the bodies came home, the official report, the years of cover-up, the competing theories, including the theory that has never officially been ruled out, that the Kursk was struck from outside by a foreign submarine, and that the second explosion was the result of that collision, rather than the Type 65-76 torpedo. We are going to look at what the K-141 Kursk's recovery from the seabed in October 2001 actually revealed inside her hull. And we are going to look at the 4 seconds of audio recorded by Russian Navy sonar on the morning of August 12, 2000, that the Russian government has never released. The K-141 Kursk lay on the floor of the Barents Sea for 14 months. Through the winter of 2000, when the surface ice came down over the Kola Peninsula and the temperature in those waters dropped to -2 degrees, she was alone. Through the spring of 2001, when the ice retreated and the Russian Navy began to plan her recovery, she was alone. The bodies of the 95 men killed in the second explosion were still inside her, in the destroyed forward compartments, where pressure and salt water and time were now the only things visiting them. The Russian government, in March 2001, awarded a contract to a Dutch consortium led by Mamouet and Smit International. They were specialists in offshore salvage. They had successfully raised a Soviet-era submarine, the Komsomolets, in 1995. They had a technique. They would attach 26 hydraulic cables to the Kursk's hull through holes pre-cut by saturation divers. They would use a specially modified barge, the Giant 4, to lift the submarine vertically off the seabed. They would lower her, still suspended underneath, into a floating drydock that had been built specifically for this operation. They would tow her back to the Russian naval base at Roslyakovo. The forward 18 meters, the destroyed bow, would be left on the seabed. There was nothing to recover from that section, and the remaining warheads, if any had survived intact, were too dangerous to lift. The operation began in August 2001. It took 2 months. On October 8, 2001, the K-141 Kursk was lowered into the Roslyakovo drydock. The water was pumped out. For the first time in 14 months, The hull of the Kursk stood in open air. The crew that had been waiting for her, Russian forensic specialists, military officers, and a small number of approved Western observers, walked alongside her. They photographed her. They documented her. They began the work of removing the bodies. The Russian government's official investigation, the Klebanov Commission, published its final report in July 2002. The conclusion was that an HTP-fueled Type 65-76 torpedo had leaked. The leak had reacted with copper components inside Tube 4, and the resulting hydrogen peroxide decomposition had caused the first explosion. The first explosion's heat had then detonated the warheads of the other forward torpedoes, causing the second, much larger explosion. The Commission found no evidence of foreign submarine involvement. They found no evidence of hostile action. They found that the cause was domestic. An old, badly maintained Russian torpedo with a known fuel hazard in a poorly inspected weapons compartment. The Commission also found that the Russian Navy's response had been inadequate, slow, and characterized by communication failures. They specifically noted the 4-day delay before international assistance was accepted. They noted the failure to inform the families. They noted the failure to inform the president. They did not assign individual blame. President Putin, by July 2002, had given several speeches accepting general responsibility for the failure. He had also dismissed several senior naval officers. He had not, however, accepted any personal blame for the 4 days he had spent in Sochi while the men in compartment 9 ran out of air. The official conclusion answered the technical question. It did not answer the human question, and it did not answer one specific physical question that has continued to bother Russian and Western analysts for the last 25 years: the size of the second explosion. The Klebanov Commission calculated that the warheads of 6 Type 65-76 torpedoes plus residual HTP fuel would produce an explosion equivalent to between 2 and 3 tons of TNT. The actual seismic readings from the Norwegian Access Station and from monitoring stations in Alaska and Sweden indicated that the second explosion was at the upper end of that range, closer to 3 tons. This was within the predicted yield, but several Western analysts, including a former US Navy submarine officer named Norman Polmar, pointed out an additional detail. The damage to the Kursk's hull, as documented by the photographs taken in the Rosliakovo drydock, included a series of inward-facing puncture holes near the bow on the starboard side that did not match the outward-facing damage expected from an internal explosion. The official explanation for these holes was that they were caused by metal debris flung backward from the second explosion. The unofficial alternative, which has never been officially ruled out, and which a small minority of investigators continue to argue, is that the holes were caused by a collision. Specifically, that the K-141 Kursk had been struck from outside by another submarine, and that the collision had ignited the HTP-fueled torpedoes in Tube 4 through impact damage to the tube's internal structure. The candidate for the colliding submarine in this theory is the US Navy attack submarine USS Memphis. The Memphis was an SSN 691 class submarine. She was, on the morning of August 12, 2000, conducting unspecified operations in the Barents Sea. She was, on the same morning, monitoring the Russian Northern Fleet exercise from a covert position. The US Navy has never disclosed the Memphis's exact location on that morning. The US Navy has acknowledged that the Memphis was in the general area. The US Navy has consistently denied that any collision occurred. The Memphis returned to Faslane Naval Base in Scotland on the evening of August 17, 2000, the day the Norwegians opened the Kursk's escape hatch. The Memphis went into dry dock immediately. She was photographed by UK journalists from the public access road outside the base. The photographs showed visible damage to the Memphis's bow. The US Navy explained the damage as routine maintenance work. The Memphis remained in dry dock for an unusually long period, approximately 3 months. The US Navy did not release the maintenance records from this period. The Memphis was decommissioned in 2011 and her hull was scrapped. The records of her August 2000 deployment have never been declassified. They are, as of 2026, still classified at the secret level. The Russian government officially has accepted the Klebanov Commission's finding that the second explosion was caused by the warheads of the remaining Type 65 to 76 torpedoes igniting from the heat of the first explosion. They have officially closed the question of foreign submarine involvement. President Putin, in 2002, said publicly that the question had been thoroughly investigated and resolved. But twice in the years since, in interviews with Russian journalists, Putin has been asked again about the possibility of a NATO submarine collision. Both times he has paused. Both times he has said he could not and would not comment further. He has not said no. We do not know with certainty what happened in the 17 seconds between the first and second explosions on the K-141 Kursk. We know that the first explosion ruptured the inner hull of the torpedo room. We know that the second explosion destroyed the entire bow. We know that the seismic signature of the second blast was at the upper end of what could be explained by the warheads alone. We know that the US submarine Memphis was nearby. We know that the Memphis came home damaged. We know that her records are sealed. We also know about the 4 seconds. On the morning of August 12, 2000, in addition to the Russian Navy's own sonar recordings, several Russian and Norwegian intelligence stations were passively recording acoustic signals from the Barents Sea, standard Cold War era practice that had simply never stopped after the Cold War ended. The sound of submarines moving, surface ships maneuvering, and weapons firing were continuously logged for analysis. 2 of these stations, one Russian, one Norwegian, captured the moments immediately before, during, and after the K-141 Kursk explosions. Both stations recorded approximately 12 hours of audio. The vast majority of it has been released to investigators. The Klebanov Commission used it. Independent analysts have used it. Journalists have used it. There is one segment that has never been released. It is 4 seconds long. According to a Russian Navy officer who left the service in 2007 and gave a single interview to a journalist named Anna Politkovskaya. Before her assassination later that year, the 4-second segment was recorded by the Russian station between 11:28:09 and 11:28:13, between the first and second explosions. The Russian officer told Politkovskaya that the segment contained an acoustic signal that was not consistent with internal submarine machinery noise. He told her The signal had been classified at the highest level by Russian naval intelligence and was not provided to the Klebanov Commission. He did not describe what the signal sounded like. He said only that after the contents of those 4 seconds were classified, he was instructed to never speak about them again. Politkovskaya was assassinated in October 2007 in the elevator of her Moscow apartment building. Her notes from that interview were seized by Russian authorities. The 4-second segment has never been released, never been described in print by any Russian official, and never been confirmed to exist by anyone other than that single anonymous source. The Russian government has not acknowledged that any such recording exists. They have also not denied that it exists. This is what we know about the K-141 Kursk. We know that 118 men boarded her on August 10th, 2000, expecting to come home. We know that 95 of them died in the second explosion before they had time to understand what was happening. We know that 23 of them survived for some period, at minimum hours, at maximum days, and that they died in compartment 9 from a chemical fire and from cold and from breathing depleted air, while help that could have reached them was sitting in Glasgow and Bergen waiting for permission. We know that Dmitri Kolesnikov used his last hours of consciousness to write a letter to his wife. We know that letter was sealed in a plastic bag the size of a man's hand and held against his chest until it was found 2 months later. We know that his wife Olga read it and that she has, in the 25 years since, given exactly 2 interviews. We know that she still lives in Vidyayevo. We know that on August 14th of every year, she takes a single rose to the dock where she last saw him alive and stands there for some time and then goes home. We know all of these things. We do not know what was in the 4 seconds of audio that the Russian government will not release. We do not know whether the Memphis hit the Kursk. We do not know whether the British LR-5 could have reached compartment 9 in time. We do not know whether the men in compartment 9 were alive at the moment. Vladimir Putin, on a beach in Sochi, decided not to return to Moscow. We do not know whether the chemical fire that killed the last of them was inevitable, or whether, in another possible history, the Norwegians had been called on the morning of August 12th instead of the evening of August 16th, and 23 men had walked off a Norwegian dive ship 4 days later, and Olga Kolesnikova had received a phone call from her husband on her birthday, and the K-141 Kursk had become a story of survival rather than a story of silence. We know that this other history did not happen. We know that on the floor of the Barents Sea, at coordinates 69 degrees, 40 minutes north, 37 degrees, 35 minutes east, in 108 meters of cold dark water, for 5 full days, 23 men waited for someone to come for them. We know that their Russian Navy did not come for them in time. We know that their president did not come back from vacation for them. We know that their wives stood on a wooden dock in Vidyayevo and waited for news that took a week to arrive and was not the news they had hoped for. We know that whatever happened in those 4 seconds of recorded sound between 11:28:09 and 11:28:13 on the morning of August 12th, 2000, has been judged by the Russian government to be too dangerous for the public to hear. We know that this judgment has held for 26 years. We know that it will likely hold for 26 more. We know that whatever the 4 seconds contain, whether the sound of metal striking metal in the moment a foreign submarine collided with the Kursk, or whether some other sound none of us has yet imagined, that sound is the sound of the moment when 118 men died. And the Russian government has decided that we will never hear it. That is the story of the K-141 Kursk. Olga Kolesnikova still lives in Vidyayevo. Her husband's letter is in a museum now, behind glass. The K-141 Kursk has been scrapped. The Type 65 to 76 torpedoes have been removed from Russian Navy service. The men of Compartment 9 are buried in cemeteries scattered across the former Soviet Union. The 4 seconds of audio remain in a vault in Moscow. And next Tuesday, we will sit together again, and we will walk through another story, another vehicle that disappeared, another set of questions the official record will not answer. Until then, sleep well.